Thank you. My name is Oscar Morgan, and I am the director of the Central East Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We're one of the centers that was just mentioned. Um, we are located in Annapolis, Maryland, and I'm going to moderate this for you. Given the events of the moment, we want to take a moment to look at what lessons have we learned and what changes do we need to make individually within our respective agencies and as within the United States as a whole to address inequities, particularly in people of color. Today, we're going to engage in an open discussion, and I have with me my colleagues, Deanna Pereira and Rocky Romero. And we're going to start with sort of self-reflection in looking at what do we need to do as from our different perspectives, and what can we suggest that may be an effort that we can take to further or actually to reduce or stop inequities within the people of color. We recognize that this is a journey. It's not going to be something that can be done overnight, but we also feel that we need to bring forth a collective effort to bring a closure to this discussion that we've been having in our country for many, many, many years. I am an administrator, so I'm going to look at this through the lens of structural racism within the behavioral health system as a whole, specifically as it relates to policing. And I, as a person of color, have been one of those who's been stopped by the police on several occasions for simply being Black. And I can tell you that I don't know any one of my peers, my family members, father, grandfather, uncles, cousins who are Black and male who've not had those same experiences where you're simply driving in your car, you're out walking, and all of a sudden you are in a situation where police are surrounding you and are accusing you of having done something. And I have been basically told when I've asked, why are you stopping me? Why are you doing what you're doing, which is taking me out of my car, putting me in handcuffs and accusing me of robbing a store? And the answer has been, well, because you're Black. And even though I have not been where they said I was, or it didn't really matter. The issue was, well, we got a report that somebody Black did this and you tag, you're it, because you happen to be in the vicinity without my having any knowledge of that. So from a structural point of view, I have always been interested in knowing why is that? Why do the police respond to Black people in this suspicious way, and oftentimes in a way that results in death or injury? And if you go back and look into the mental health system, you will notice that, or you will know that in 1851, at that point in time, a very prominent psychiatrist named Samuel Cartwright suggested that individuals who were then living on plantations or in slavery, if they would leave the plantation through flight to get away from this particular life, that they had a mental illness. And it was the first time that I can find out that people of color, particularly Black people, were classified as having a mental illness as a class of people. And that mental illness he defined as drapetomania. And it really means to leave the plantation. And in his mind, anyone who would leave this life where you were provided with food, water, and shelter, even though you were enslaved, that you had to be, quote, crazy. And that it was the right of the overseers, then known, which we equated today as police, to do something about that. And what you needed to do in terms of in terms of treatment, as prescribed by Dr. Cartwright, if you will, was to chase people down. And if you caught them, then the treatment was to beat the devil out of them. That was what he prescribed. And he also prescribed that the more you beat, the more the person tried to escape or put up a fight, then the more you needed to beat them because they were so possessed by the devil, you had to get it out of them. So if you take this dynamic of having the police of the day of 1851, and you then trace it to today's world, and you look at who we call police now, through their through history and through their means of passing down this information, police are now doing the same thing. And it started in some respects with the mental health system. So we have to look inside and realize that the mental health system has its own structural racism that we are suffering from today. And what I would like to propose is that in this debate of fund and defund is not necessarily to defund the police, but here in my own county, our police department has a long history of working with our crisis response team, our mental health providers, where they jointly go out to respond to a mental health or behavioral health crisis. And in fact, our police department just about 3 weeks ago received the International Award for having the best police department on the planet because they have engaged with our mental health system to respond to behavioral health issues. But even with that acknowledgement and even with all the work they've done, there's still room for improvement. So as a director of the Central East Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, we're going to be working with our crisis center because we went and looked at the data and found that in today's world of COVID and inequities and all the things that are going on, people are calling the crisis hotline because of their fears of being called out because they're Black, their fears of being Hispanic or a person of color, their fear of being in a situation where they may have to call for help, and they get in an entanglement with the police. So we're going to start a program with, and actually we just finished it about an hour ago, with Johns Hopkins University, 26 churches. We're going to be training peers who will be working with the crisis hotline in our county to identify people who are calling in because they have their anxiety, if you will, around today's events. And those peers will be trained in psychological first aid by Johns Hopkins University. And we will train them as well. And they will be partnered with people who are calling in for help. And our social service agencies have agreed to let those individuals have a direct path into their agencies so that their issues can be addressed immediately or within a reason as a way of preventing them from having to have further contact or no contact, I should say, with the police in case their behaviors evolve to that point. And this would be a way of getting upstream so that we can divert having to call the police, because in the United States, if you have a behavioral problem, the police are going to come. And this is one way to change that structure so that hopefully police will never have to come out to get involved with someone who's having issues. And this will be even beyond what we're doing today in my county. So that's just one example. And now I would like to turn it over to Deanna, who can talk a little bit more about herself and some examples that she maybe would like to present to you as a way of addressing inequities. Deanna?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? I said, thank you, Oscar. And thank you everyone for being here. I see we reached our maximum of 501 participants. So I'm definitely glad I'm doing it virtually. I think if it was in person, I'll be freaking out even more. But this also shows the importance of this topic and how passionate we are about coming together and finding solutions to move forward. So I just want to begin with telling a little bit about my story. I'm from Colombia, originally from Bogota, and I have a degree in physical therapy. And then I immigrated to the United States about 14 years ago to further my education. So I received a master's in public health, and then I received a PhD in social work. And became really interested in topics of public health and the intersection of nutrition and physical activity. So I have worked about 10 years in community-based interventions that help to promote healthy environments, particularly in communities of color or underserved communities. And about 4 years ago, I personally discovered yoga and meditation. And at the time, I was going through a intense personal crisis, and the discovery of this activity to which I had not been exposed before was very useful for me. And I became a yoga instructor, and I started teaching yoga at a nonprofit organization that serves Hispanic immigrants here in St. Louis. And through my work in that agency, which lasted for about 2.5 years, I witnessed how much, an activity like this, to which these women had never been exposed before and never even maybe thought they could do it, because the perception that we get sometimes of wellness, it's very much segregated to a particular group, right? So many of them never even thought about going into a yoga studio, and if they did, the registration was probably about $100, which they couldn't afford. And to me, this was a very eye-opening experience about how we can expand interventions that are not so much intensive, and that they can really make a difference in a person's life. And through that path, I also discovered mindfulness, which in Spanish is known as atención plena, conciencia plena. And again, started working with this population, started seeing the benefits of it on myself. And mindfulness is an activity and a practice that has actually been shown to really help us be self-aware and self-aware our own biases, which in the current crisis and everything that is happening, that, like Oscar mentioned, has been happening for years now, but it's really coming to the forefront. This simple practice can really help us to develop an awareness of our own biases, our own prejudices, our own perceptions of the world and of the others. And so I became a mindfulness instructor. And currently I am working at Washington University in St. Louis. I am with the School of Social Work, and I also teach I'm part-time with the School of Social Work, and then my other part-time, I am teaching Spanish, Hispanic or Latino immigrants here in St. Louis, mindfulness and meditation. And it has been a wonderful experience. We know from the research that these interventions have normally included mostly white participants or middle income or high income participants, and is not so much geared towards immigrants or lower income or communities of color. And this is also sometimes a result of funding, sometimes biases. So there's been studies that have shown that people of color, investigators at universities that are people of color, their topics usually tend to be geared towards community-based interventions, public health initiatives that benefit their own populations, and they get less funding, sadly. So the other problem is that there's not many providers that are able to speak Spanish or in culturally sensitive way to deliver these interventions. And so that creates a gap. And my goal is just to bring these tools to people because they really help me as an immigrant in this country, and leading with, compassion for myself and also compassion to others, which sometimes we can kind of lose sense of that. And this practice, it's really about that. It's about recognizing our strength, recognizing how brave we are, especially for people that have come into this country sometimes with an American dream, and then they're faced with so many obstacles, and they continue to face them. And with the current crisis of COVID, this is even more important because they're seeing it firsthand and experiencing all the damaging consequences of being isolated or not receiving treatment in some cases, having their families in a different country, not being able to connect with them. And so that's what I'm doing at the moment. And I am looking forward to the questions segment of the session, because I can answer more questions about how specifically am I leading or doing with these interventions. And I think that's it for now. I think I will turn it to Rocky.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm excited to be back with you. Those of you that may have joined us yesterday with the MHTTC. Today, I'm real enthused. I'm a little bit emotional in the sense that we're finally getting a platform to talk about institutional racism and practice and policies that have impacted people of color and people with kind of the same shade of color of skin that I have, in very negative ways, and it's long overdue, honestly. I think without getting into an emotional tizzy here, I think it's important to know that people of color are tired and fed up, and you see that through the social discourse that's coming out within our communities now, where people are protesting. People around the country, around the world, are protesting in support of Black Lives Matter movements and other movements that, again, are now addressing people of color's issues. And I'm excited about that, but I think at the same time, now we have a lot of work to do as people of color, and especially as practitioners, as scholars, as researchers in looking at it through institutional racism and the intersection of mental health. We have a lot of layers to kind of peel back. So today I'm going to talk about a few instances, again, looking at kind of personal reflections, but also looking at it from some of the experiences that I've had in my own journey as a male person of color in academia. Very limited percentage of us kind of make it through onto academia and onto higher education, which is very sad, because there's a lot of folks that are much brighter than myself that could really do the work and are doing the work in our communities, and we have to validate that community-based experience model just as much as we do higher ed or education, looking at it from kind of a Paulo Freire type of view, if you will. One of the things that I really want to touch on today, again, is I'm going to kind of make 3 points. One, critical self-reflection, and I'm really happy that our two other panelists, Oscar and Diana, talked about this in their own kind of critical self-reflection. I'm going to talk about kind of some of the microaggressions that I experienced in my kind of journey through higher ed and into mental health, and of course into my doctoral work, which is very much focused on institutional racism and looking at legacies of colonization. And then the third area that I'll cover within my time of about 15 minutes or so is how policies and practices have impacted access to treatment, right? And in that, meaning that the language that we use matters. When we use policy that is creating or perpetuating a us versus them dichotomy, we have to call that out and we have to correct that. as practitioners, as researchers, and of course, those of us that are administrators or in different roles. So briefly, just a little bit of about my background as we get into this, you kind of know what perspective I'm coming from. 15 years in academia, as I kind of went through the PhD journey and ended that experience. And being a glutton for punishment, I guess, as those of you that have experienced that, it's not fun to some of it. But we want to make sure that, you know, giving me that kind of education perspective, academia perspective, really allowed me to do self-reflection and know that that wasn't necessarily the venue for me to do this type of work that I want to do. So getting back to community-based work, getting back to community love and education and community-based experiences is important to me. So now I've been running my own company, J.R. Romero and Associates. Started off as just doing consulting, one project at a time, and now I hold a couple of contracts. One is providing consulting and training for the MHTTC, which I am humbled and blessed to be able to do. I'm excited about this because now we're doing a series of these talks like Oscar mentioned, and this is just the beginning. So hang on with us and stay with us in this series. So I'm going to get back to the 3 points that I wanted to make. Critical self-reflection. As practitioners and providers, if you haven't gone through that journey of critical self-reflection and been made uncomfortable at times, I think then there may be a little bit more work to be done. When we're in a position where we see things happening and they don't make us cringe or they don't make us take a second look about how people of color are treated, then we may have to look a little bit deeper in ourselves of why are we okay with that practice? Why are we okay with that? So with that said, a certain amount of discomfort is important, I believe, in critical self-reflection. To my point, my experience in research, and I was very much kind of an oddball within my doctoral program in terms of my research project for my dissertation. I did a qualitative critical discourse analysis rather than a quantitative approach like every other doctoral student in our program was required to do. And I was thankful that my chair, my committee chair, was willing to take that fight with me. And really get pushed back, you know, from other faculty and other communities. So with that research, I was able to do a history of my family, looking at genealogies and looking at the history specifically of colonization in the United States, specific to Juan de Oñate and Spanish colonization in 1598. And that took me on a journey that was originally, to a degree, because I was, I think, brainwashed to a certain point, that I should feel pride in that colonization. I should feel pride in that oppression. I should feel pride in the murdering and enslavement of indigenous people. And I cannot be honest, early on that felt okay with me. It was a connection to my culture and to my pride and to my history. As I got to my family history and uncovered more through our genealogy, I uncovered a photo that showed a picture of my great-great-grandfather with my great-grandmother as a little infant baby. And on the outer skirts of the photo, if you can imagine, was a Native American woman standing with her traditional garb kind of covered up. And at first that stood out to me, and I kind of questioned it, right? So I started looking further at it. And we know through history of colonization that encomiendas were created, right? Encomiendas meaning, if you want to use a very much more direct word, I think that's more accurate, basically enslavement camps, right? With the indigenous people that were already a part of this territory. And that was like a kick to my gut, right? It was like a shock to me to know that my family had that encomienda history within our family genealogy. So through the tears and through the tears on my pages on my dissertation as I wrote, I had to emotionally, I think, cognitive dissonance, right? And that's a part of this struggle and this journey that we each as practitioners have to understand. Cognitive dissonance is going to push us back to where we're comfortable when we start to face discomfort with being biased, with being racist, with being seeing things in a certain way that we've been brainwashed, trained, programmed to see things. cognitive dissonance is important for us to realize, because it can push us back to our comfort zone, and it can push us away from feeling discomfort. And if we're able to push through the discomfort, I guarantee you'll be more genuine in your approaches. If you're a person that's not a person of color, a provider from a dominant group that's serving people of color, you'll be more genuine in your approaches to that, at least in my experience. The other piece that I see that's very important, again, is I felt at that point a struggle between two cultures. Because for whatever reason, I always felt connected to Indigenous communities. I've worked in Indigenous communities since I took on my first kind of social work job, as I started my associates and undergraduate in social work. And I always felt more connected to that side of my DNA, if you will, than I did my European dominant kind of percentage. And I've always struggled with that. I've always kind of felt like, where do I fit in? Where do I sit? And I'm still working through that. So through that experience and going through higher education as a person of color, dark little Latino kid or Chicano kid from Espanola Valley, which, you know, has its own setbacks, its own issues, but is a beautiful place, and I would never want to call anywhere else my home. I came with a chip on my shoulder, and I went to academia always feeling like I was subordinate to everybody else. I was one of the only males in an all pretty much dominant female cohort, right, with social work. And then even further with clinical social work, I was one of the only person of color in a all almost white classroom with clinical social workers and psychologists, right, in a dual program in that sense at that time. So with that said, that inferiority for me kind of took hold, right? And I didn't know where I fit in. And I knew when I talked, when I spoke, and even now as a professional, as I spoke in certain situations, I could hear people or see people talking side chatter, right? And that, when we look at institutional racism or racism, those are the microaggressions that some of us perpetuate in our own practices that we may not be fully aware of. And I think that's where critical self-reflection comes in. What are the things I say about people of color that may be tearing down at them, not giving them the credit that they deserve? Maybe saying things like, wow, you speak well. Well, why wouldn't I? I have close to 10 years of education. I was born in the United States. My parents speak English. Why wouldn't I speak well, right? So there's an assumption that goes along with those statements, right? When people say, oh, you speak well. Oh, you're a doctor. Oh, wow. Okay. So, right. It took me a while to get through that. Now I don't apologize about those things. Now I'm very comfortable where I am in the reflection that I've done. And I hope, again, as a clinical social worker, that critical self-reflection really helped me to go through the emotion, but also to gain a better foot on why I had certain biases against dominant groups in my communities. Well, it's because of my experiences. As Oscar mentioned, when you're continually oppressed or spoken about in certain ways, you start to get kind of this chip on your shoulder and kind of this, what would I say? It's kind of a continuation or a legacy of colonization in a weird sort of way, right? That is perpetuated since slavery, since encomiendas, and we take that forward with us as people of color that have oral histories. And one thing I want to say about this before I move on to my next point is, you know, if you're somebody that doesn't come from groups that have been oppressed, colonized, be careful about how you speak about those situations, right? I hear very often, and I cringe every time I hear it, well, it's been 500 years, why can't people just get over that? Especially recently with some of the issues that we've seen in New Mexico rise up now because of the conflict between indigenous and Hispanic or Spanish populations, right? And it's very important for us to realize that oral history is a very important value within communities of color and people of color, especially indigenous communities. So when they pass those stories on to their children, those stories continue to make meaning 500 years later. So let's be aware of that as a cultural value moving forward. What I saw with these experiences for me is that it really helped me to validate other people's experiences, clients that I was seeing that were coming to me reporting, I feel a certain way. I have a certain feeling in my stomach that I can't report. And a lot of times Latinos report physical symptomatology, when it's really more connected to a mental health situation, right? When we kind of do the work with clinical assessment and intake. What we have to understand is that uneasy feeling, maybe the oppression that they're feeling from the community that they're in. If they're in higher ed or they're in schools, even for public schools are not created to help people of color succeed. It's to weed out those people of color. And I know sometimes when I say these things, it may be controversial, but schools are doing exactly what they're meant to do. They're meant to weed out those kids that should go to the military, usually people of color, students of color, and others that are going on to AP programs, right? That are STEM programs and are tracked and are going into these AP classes and are going on to careers in as attorney and as doctors and other things, when kids of color are being put into frontline war, right? When we kind of look at the history of this. So the other piece that I want to just really touch on, and I have about 3 or 4 minutes left. Like Diana mentioned, I think it's important that we do have plenty of time for questions. I think that's going to also help us. So in your questions, please keep in mind that as we generate those questions, we're going to also utilize some of that to generate the next series of webinars that we bring to you on this topic. So leading to question 2 that we were asked to address, kind of how has this led to some of the policies or practices? For me, practices specifically that are guided by the use of language becomes very important, right? When we talk about language use over history, language has been used to subjugate people and to keep groups of people in certain categories and in a caste or a hierarchy, right? When we talk about race and racism. With that said, discourse and rhetoric continue to oppress people of color further by perpetuating this us and them dichotomy, right? Dominant group against immigrants, against illegal immigrants, against the other. And when Mr. Trump, the leader of our country, continues to use language of criminal, illegal alien, we're going to put up, we're going to stop immigration at the borders, right? Well, who are coming in at the borders? People of color. And when they're considered criminal or they're considered racist, and when we have protesters, which are a dominant, group of people of color, and we hear words like violent protesters, criminals, right, agitators, and yet to describe the dominant group that maybe they're fighting people of color and fighting these peaceful protesters, we hear our president say, those are folks that are good people, fine people, to use his words, right? So when those dichotomies in that language is used, young people see that and they read that and they hear that, and all of the social media and all of the other forms of discourse that they're engaging in and they're absorbing, and it continues that chip on their shoulder, and it continues to make them feel like they're in a world where it's us against them, right? With that said, I think we have to remember language matters. And we can't not continue to engage in critically analyze discourse when it comes to policy analysis and when it comes to policy formation. With that said, I'll end with this. When we're looking at policies, we have to look at the document in terms of a couple of points that I'll just introduce, and then I hope to be able to talk about this in another webinar that we have here shortly in the next couple of months. But we have to look at who is mentioned in a document, right, in a policy. What racial groups are mentioned in a document? Those groups that are typically mentioned first on that document are usually the group that is given the most resources within a policy that has resource allocation within those policies. And this is through a discourse analysis that I've done of several hundred policy analysis over the years. And it also has really specific things where we see the order of those groups on that document, right? So I'm just kind of sharing some very basic things that when you look at a document, when you look at a policy and procedure, read through that and see what groups are listed on there and what groups are not, right? It's really telling also when certain racial groups are left out of policy completely. What does that say about those groups? Are they not important enough to mention in this policy? Right? And we see that a lot in New Mexico. It's usually either Native American or Spanish or Hispanic There's never ever mention of African American, Black groups, any other racial groups in New Mexico, like they don't exist. It's very interesting. Lastly, I'll leave you with this. The othering of groups within policy is very key. The use of they and theirs as opposed to us, and inclusion, right, of language, and the use of language continues this dichotomy, and it continues the very important legacy of colonization relative to divide and conquer, right? Which, if we were to come together as people of color and people that want to support people of color in general, and support other dominant members of other groups that are progressive in that sense, we would make a big impact in politics, right? And I'll leave it with that. The last thing that I'll give to you all, and then I'll turn it back to Oscar so that we can kind of go to questions, is I want to just give a plug for the MHTTC. The National Hispanic Latino MHTTC is able to really help with some of this work. If you're engaging in this conversation, you want to, have some time consulting with us, getting some feedback on how to approach maybe your agency, maybe your director, maybe your administration, maybe a school board on addressing institutional racism. We can help consult on that. We can also help consult on specific trainings and developing specialized trainings for your programs and your groups. So please reach out to us. The email was given to you at the beginning, and it'll be available here at the end as well. So thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions and for us moving forward with this series. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone who's attending. And we just wanted to give you today sort of a really brief overview of how this term that we use, structural racism, is embedded in implicit and explicit biases, ranging from very overt activities such as the police engagement to microaggressions in terms of how people refer to you or address you. And so it has many different forms, but the bottom line is it devalues the individuals, particularly people of color, and we've all been exposed to that regardless of our walks in life. Whether we are, and importantly now, we need to come together and try to address this issue so we can move on and uplift our entire community. So Cindy, who is one of our production assistants, has been keeping tally of the questions. And so Cindy, I'm going to now let you moderate this through the question and answer period.
Yes, thank you, Oscar. We do have a couple of questions. I was just trying to make sure. I know Sean is listening to us on the phone. Sean was the other panelist that we have for today, but I cannot find Sean on the list to unmute you. So Sean, if you're listening to me, if you could just write to us, because I know you should be on listening to us. It would be awesome if you could add your thinking to this panel. While we do that, I'm gonna start with the questions, and if he gets the chance to come in, I'll just let him speak before we continue with the rest of the questions. Okay, with that said, let's start with this. And this was directed to Oscar when he started talking. And it says, what is your opinion on becoming more fluent in Spanish? Sometimes I feel like these crucial conversations benefit from a native language translator, but often I do not have access.
Well, language is important. And I do think that we should speak in a language that is relevant to the targeted population, and that we shouldn't speak over people's heads. I do not speak Spanish, but what people don't know about me is my son is from Nicaragua. And even in that, I get a lot of questions in terms of, well, why do you have a son who is from Nicaragua? Why couldn't you adopt a black child? Well, I didn't ask for it. I wasn't looking for a son or anybody else at the time that this young man came into my life. So I think we need to accept people for who they are with all their frailties as well as their gifts and try to come to an understanding. So yes, I may not know all the words that are being said when someone is speaking in a language other than English, but I definitely know when you're talking about me. So I don't know if the other panelists want to, Rocky, language is one of your areas of expertise. So do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I concur. I think, you know, again, if we're talking about the use of language in many different kind of practices, it's extremely important. So for one, I kind of look at language in terms of access to services, right? Are services presented in the language of the population that you're meant to serve, and not that you want to serve, not that has the easiest way to access your services, right? But are you going into communities that don't necessarily have the ability maybe to read the language that you're using even? Do you go into communities that language is in many respects to them something that has been used to oppress certain groups, right? To not produce language or forms or documents in their language intentionally so that they are left out of things, right? And there's a long history of that. And I think especially, and I'll kind of speak to my own kind of, you know, reference point of New Mexico. There's a long history, and not just in New Mexico, but even with indigenous communities, of our government entering into treaties and using language that the indigenous groups weren't fully understanding. And that practice has carried on into mental health practices and medical practices, right? So I think the use of language and being an advocate for the use of appropriate language and language in, of course, the dialect that is specific to those groups that you're trying to reach, we become, in my mind, ethically responsible. And if you're looking at class standards, that's a very important document to look at. If you ever want, as a provider, some kind of federal legal documentation to be able to stand on with your administration or with other groups, class standard says that services must be provided in the language that you are serving based on federal law, especially if you are receiving federal funding, right? So those are things that we have to start to utilize more, just like dominant groups have used against people of color over time. People of color have to now use legal discourse to help further our access and our treatment. Hope that helps.
Thank you both for the answer. We're trying to reach Sean. I think we're gonna call him and just put him on speaker so that we can hear what he has to say. And while that happens,
Cindy, I think
then-
he's here.
oh, you got it?
Yeah. So Sean, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Sounds
Can
beautiful.
everyone? Okay, perfect. Okay, so Sean, if you want to add something from your perspective, I think that would be excellent.
Yeah, I know that you're talking about language. And I think it's really important for people to understand that, you know, I've heard people ask me where I'm from because I speak English well. But, you know, and then when I said that I was from here, they asked about my parents. I said they're from here. They asked about my ancestry. They're from here. And then finally they said, oh, you must be a Native American. I said, yes. So then I usually ask, well, where are your ancestors from? But the thing about it is that English is the foreign language in the Americas. It was not here before. And that's something that I think people need to remember that. And looking at that from a Native standpoint is that we have a lot of foreign policies in a sense, foreign occupancy. We have a foreign history within our schools. We're taught European history, but it that history doesn't pertain to the Native Americans within our school system. I really liked what they were talking about before, talking about speaking to people in their own language so they can understand. And it's very important with confidentiality and things like that, especially federal confidentiality. They have the 42 CFR for substance abuse, and it states that you're supposed to be able to speak it in their language or to be able to speak it so that they understand that, and you're supposed to make sure that they do understand those. So I think looking back at many different things, it's very important that people take a lot of other things into consideration with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for adding on that topic. So let's continue with the questions. The next one says, and I don't know if Oscar wants to start, and then we'll just go through everybody else just like we did. Because it's based on what you were talking about, and it says, can it be said that some of the systematic racism and racism in mental health stems from slavery?
Yes, I mean, you have to understand when, you know, as Sean just said, you know, there were people here before Columbus, and you have to also understand that the United States was built in basically two parts. Those that were coming from Europe who were in the northern part were coming for religious freedoms. People who were in the South were in many ways expelled from Europe because of their own crimes and omissions. And when they came, the mindset was to conquer. And it was about, I am the individual and I'm going to get mine. Whereas the individuals in the North were about community. And so people were brought to this country from Africa and their experience was such that they were discounted. You know, you're here to serve, you're here to work for me. And you think then of implicit bias, which is really important because what happened is that even those things may have been explicit in our Constitution, where people of color were considered to be less than white men, and then the actions of people are very important, because if you can think of mother, father, sister, brother sitting around the table and telling stories about, well, Black people are not human, Black people are less than, Black people are here to work for me and to make me prosperous, those things get embedded in our bones through generations and generations. And soon we act upon those without even knowing that we're acting upon them. You know, I mean, as a person of color, because I know that my grandfather had to leave at the age of 17 while he was working because of an encounter he had with a white woman, he was given a choice. You do what I say you do, or you will be killed. He left running that day, to the point where even as an old man, he refused to go back to Mississippi out of fear. And so the idea of my going to Mississippi was never in my, that was something I would not do. That was a foreign country that I would not go into. So we build these, so we have these assumptions, we have these biases, you will, based on our lived experience. And the question is, how do we validate or invalidate those? And a lot of that is through, again, our lived experiences, but we have to understand that the slavery was of people of color was the beginning of myths that still exist today and are still lived and perpetuated by what is perceived to be the dominant population. And what we have to do is not to give ownership to those views through our own actions. Rocky or Deanna, anyone wants to take that on?
Yeah, I think I just want to add briefly that, so from my own experience, I really resonated with a lot of the things you were saying, Rocky, about that complex, that inferiority complex. And I think, you know, just like racism is a virus, when we, you know, as communities of color and have been come from oppressed, you know, in my case, a lot of like colonization in South America, and also just immigration, you know, in my country due to the violence. Like my parents immigrated, I immigrated, like a lot of people did, and it does harm. And what I saw with the people that I was dealing with is that they suffered from depression. I have suffered from depression, anxiety, and it's not to the point yet where it is like clinical. It can be prevented. The waiting list here in St. Louis in many of the organizations for mental health services is about 6 months. So it's really it's a very, very critical and sad situation, and it is one of the reasons why I thought that these mindfulness interventions that are group interventions, you know, they're safe spaces, they create community engagement. Latino culture is very much about community and sharing their experiences when they feel safe. And, you know, I deliver the classes in Spanish. So I think, you know, it does. I will say that yes, that this problem stems from a lot of the mentality of slavery, of colonization, this inferiority complex, which you would think that someone that has been like very educated, you know, like Rocky was saying, I've strived and I've got like tons of degrees and I still feel like I'm not enough. And I've done my work, you know, I've done a lot of personal work in therapy, but not everybody is as lucky, you know, not everybody has the same knowledge or tools or resources where they can access those things that can really make a difference. So that's all I wanted to add, and that's it. And then at the end, I do want to read a quote, but that's at the end.
This is Rocky again. I echoing what Oscar and Indiana talked about, I think is important, right? There's a couple of things I pulled out of that is, you know, looking at how this cumulative process of racism over time is generational, right? It's passed on through generations, through racism, through stories, through experiences, through don't go into that neighborhood, those people live there, that kind of thing, right? That has been perpetuated over time. I think the other piece that we see is we have to really look at what was the mental health institution, right? What was that created for? It was meant to sort people. Again, it's a mechanisms for sorting and categorizing people based on a diagnosis that is created in a Western society that doesn't consider other cultures, South American and others, right? It really is a Western type of view in the sense of where it was created. It's evolved over time, obviously, but I think those are the things like Oscar mentioned is what are the components, and those are the things that I think I want to leave you with is what are the legacies of colonization? What are the legacies of slavery and institutional racism that have been embedded in policy and practices that are still a part of policy and practices today, right? Those are the things that we have to critically look at, I believe, again, when we're talking about kind of the analysis and how we validate that. And the system of mental health and diagnosis and assessment was created for a certain reason, right? And it was meant to put those that were different or other, right? The bell hooks and her kind of use of othering people comes into play, and it really puts people in an othering category when they used to institutionalize people, right, for mental illness, rather than being able to treat them in community-based services. So we have to do our kind of our research a little bit in terms of the history of the system of mental health, and how has that been perpetuated with racism practices over time. So excellent questions. Thank you for that.
And I just want to add to
And
that, if I may, and I'm not cognizant of time, so help me out. But you know, there was a time, if you look at our history, where again, because of slavery, Black people were assumed not to be human enough to have a mental illness. So if you think about social determinants in today's terms, which is where you live, work, and play, and we know that 86% of our health and mental wellness is derived from where we work, live, and play. So you take people of color, African Americans, bring them to the United States, put them into a place where they are deprived of where they born, work, and play. You already establish an unhealthy environment. And people were, it was assumed by that Black people were not human enough to have feelings. So after the emancipation, when there was a celebration of freedoms, if you go back to policy, what you will see in 1800s, early 1900s, psychiatric institutions that were built for the Negro people. There's one literally 3 miles from my house, Crownsville Hospital. I can walk to it. And if you go and look at the top of that the buildings, on the name is the Negro Asylum, Insane Asylum. And the reason for that is because we were happy. And we were then classified as being delirious, because how could Black people be so happy? And we were so happy till we were, quote, mentally ill. And the way that you dealt with that happiness was that you put people into institutions. So this notion of people being round up like we see now in this country, of people being incarcerated, that's nothing new. That's just a perpetuation of how Black people have been dealt with for generations and generations and generations. The reasoning may have changed, but the outcome is the same. You don't belong. You can't be happy. You can't live in certain places. You can't walk in certain places. You can't do what I do because you're not human enough to do what other people do. And for that reason, you have to be punished. And in some cases, taken out of society. And we're not aware of that because these are things that we take as for granted, but it's based upon explicit, implicit biases that have been going on for years.
so, Sean, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I would.
Go ahead.
I really enjoyed this part of it, because what we're talking about here really kind of resonates with a lot of things that happened within the past within the Native Americans. I mean, looking at the history, a lot of times our people weren't even considered human beings, definitely less than. We were called savages, heathen savages. Sometimes people still kind of use that today. While on our end, we're being treated inhumanely and savagely. Even looking at today, policies. There are still policies today that are still going on from back in that period. We are required to have a degree of Indian blood. So there are animals, in a sense, that we're placed with them. We're among animals that are required to have a pedigree, just like horses and dogs. And that is the same thing as the degree of Indian blood. We have to be able to prove we are Indian, or Indianness, or whatever it might be. Our past leadership were placed in insane asylums, like what he was talking about earlier. And those same kind of belief systems carry on today. If you look at the mental health system, assessments, things like that, many times our beliefs are seen as delusions, and some of our inherent gifts that we have for spirituality are considered hallucinations. But looking at many of the kind of newer age thing going on today with psychics, mediums, a lot of this stuff like that, it's not seen the same way. But when we do it, it's seen as something wrong, something bad, something evil, or something like that. When even like when we talk about our creator, sometimes people said, oh, you have a different God, but that's not the case. I mean, it's really just one God by many names. And a lot of times that we're looked at like there's something wrong with us. I mean, you're looking at the MMPI, is that we constantly have higher scores with the MMPI. The mental health system was not based upon our belief systems. So they don't always kind of into the mental health spectrum and things like you see today. Even looking at how people are seen as, if you look at Alzheimer's, usually then it goes into dementia and later on delirium. Within our culture, we see that as a normal part of life. When we see our ancestors around us at that time, what we're really seeing is they are here to meet us and to help us in the crossing over, so that it's more of a natural process. It's not like a shock and where we're going to go. We have people there who know us and are willing to help us and lead us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And the next question was directed to all the presenters. So I wanted to start with you, Sean. The question says, I find spaces like this to be very healing for me as a grad student of color surrounded by a majority of white academic setting. Do you have an insight, or can all of you share personal experiences on the balance between pushing for a change within your program or workplace and preserving and caring for your own mental health as a person of color? If we could start with Sean and then we'll go with the rest of the panelists.
Schools or different beliefs, like for instance, the Bering Straits theory. We need to remember that is only a theory. Evidence supports that Native Americans were here far earlier than that. So we kind of ask ourselves, is why are people so bent on trying to prove that we are not from this land when our ancestors have been saying we were for so long? Even at times when we have something to say that might be very important, or to the history, or anything like that, we're not listened to. They think of what we have to say is unimportant when it really is very important. I mean, even within schools, as growing up, I was slapped, hit by teachers, had my hair pulled, and everything like that. But definitely got paddled in school. But a lot of times I was telling the truth, but I was punished as if I was lying. But no matter what, I kept telling the truth. It wasn't until a principal, who was a Vietnam veteran, looked further into what I was saying and finally believed me. And that person actually became somebody that I looked up to and aspired to become like. So when we look at history, a lot of times the history is written by victors. We know that. But a lot of times within the history, what we know about history is not written in the books. And a lot of times it's purposely left out. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know who wants to go next. I saw Rocky doing the hand thing. I don't know if let's do Rocky, Diana, and then Oscar.
Yeah, can you repeat the question, Sydney, just so I make sure I'm addressing it correctly again?
Yes, it says if you have insight, or can you share personal experiences on the balance between pushing for change within your program or workplace and preserving and caring for your own mental health as a person of color?
Yeah, great question. I think for me, in kind of going through that experience and continuing to experience that, I think it's one, knowing your audience and knowing who may be receptive to that message, right? I think it's one thing to try to advocate and to try to push people on an individual basis, but when you hear people immediately bring up all the reasoning and all the reasons why they're challenging what you're saying and don't have a willingness to just listen, you have to really use your energy wisely. And I think that would be one key that I would share for you. I think you have to pick your battles. What are the consequences of losing whatever conflict you're engaging in, or whatever point you're addressing as an advocate? I think self-care is critical. You have to do that throughout. And if you're not doing that not only just in clinical social work or in social work field in and of itself, but if you're engaging the racism part and engaging in racist confrontation, and because sometimes we have to confront racism and racists, right? If you're taking this journey, that can be very, very daunting, and it can be very emotional. It can bring up a lot of fear and a lot of emotions that you didn't know were kind of pent up inside of you. So I just think be ready to pick your battles and pick them wisely. Now, if you're looking at change within institutions, know the institution that you're trying to change. Academia and higher education, if you're thinking that you're gonna, as one student within a program, gonna change a whole academic kind of trajectory of courses and all of that, you have a really huge obstacle ahead of you, right? Especially as a student. Now, the other thing in that, if you're the only voice that's speaking up out of a student body of, let's say you have 20, 30, 40 in your graduate cohort, and you're the only one speaking out, how much energy do you have to carry that forward alone, right? So you have to find allies, and you have to find those allies not only in professors and other researchers, faculty, but you also, and there may be one on a faculty that you align with, you research, you ask them if maybe you can co-author, maybe can we do a research project together, can we present? But you have to also be careful, because I've seen people that take on fighting against racist agendas or oppressive agendas can sometimes within a bureaucracy and a system be ostracized from that system as well. So just be cautious as a student, especially. Don't kind of commit professional suicide in a way, right? Don't take your own future out of your hands. Be tactful, and the other thing that I will say with this is, if you're willing to take this fight on, do your homework, do your research, know what you're talking about. Be able to, Derek Bell, I believe, talks about having what does he talk about? Having kind of your rhetoric ready to respond, right? It's kind of like a boxing match. You have to kind of have your argument ready and formulate that in advance of people that are going to come at you. The last thing that I'll leave, and I'll pass on the baton, is for those of you that haven't done any kind of research on race and institutional racism, Race, the Power of an Illusion is a very, very good video, and it's a primer, right? And it really gives you factual data and information that you can start to arm yourself. A repertoire of responses is what Derek Bell used to say. Arm yourself with a repertoire of responses that is based in fact, based in policy, not based on emotion, right? Because then as a person of color, what will people from the dominant group say? Oh, he's crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Look at him. He can't even control himself. He's angry. He's upset. He's just another angry person of color. Well, that may be so, but I've learned to calm that, and I can give you my points, my repertoire of responses, right? So race, the power of an illusion, and I believe there's 3 segments to that. If you can't find it, email me and I'll try to see if I can somehow get you a link or a copy to that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Rocky, and thank you for that question. I can completely resonate, and I feel your pain. I understand, I do, and I understand how deeply frustrated it can be. I 100% agree with you, Rocky. As a person that practices meditation and yoga, and going through actually a very similar situation recently in academia, I had to put my mental health first and my well-being, and then also, like Rocky said, picking your battles. And for me, it was moving more into community work and serving, right? Service and people that are really needing my help, and where I can feel like I'm doing something. So I will say to you, if you're feeling discouraged, disenfranchised, and you can really not find an outlet or support or allies at your institution or organization, find other ways in which you can also just channel that passion for justice that you have within yourself. Because I also understand that it can be extremely defeating. It can seem very alienating and demoralizing. So just take care of yourself first, and find ways in which you can support others that are going through similar struggles. And I know I'm very mindful of time, but I do want to say this quote by Nelson Mandela, and I will say it in English and in Spanish. So it says, no one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Ahora en español, dice, nadie nace odiando a otra persona por su color de piel o su pasado o su religión. Las personas deben aprender a odiar. Y si ellas pueden aprender a odiar, ellas también se les puede enseñar a amar, ya que el amor viene más naturalmente al corazón humano que su opuesto. And I will leave it at there.
Well, I think we're about ready to wrap up. So I'm going to answer the question, and then if you allow me to wrap this up as well. And if we have more time, just let me know, because I don't want to make assumptions. But I think the first thing to acknowledge, and I really appreciate that question, is that this is a lonely battlefield. Number one, it's lonely because there is a dearth of people of color who are in the mental health field as a whole. And maybe what we can do in one of our future meetings is invite Dr. Manuel Paris from Yale, who can give you statistics on the number of mental health professionals who are people of color in the United States. And at the same time, we have an overwhelming number of people of color who are in the public mental health system. So you have a situation where the predominant number of mental health providers are older, meaning 40 to 50-year-old white women who are addressing the needs of Black and brown people, particularly males. And so you get into that old dynamic of their perceptions versus our perceptions, and this whole thing of managing behavior as opposed to welcoming behavior. So if I am passionate, the counselor, if you will, may perceive me as being aggressive. Because as children, we're learned to express ourselves. Everybody has a voice. And so you get into all those dynamics. So just understand that the odds are against us in many ways. However, the way I would advise, and it's been said before, is find a mentor. And that might be someone within the Mental Health Association in your city or your state, NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, or other groups that may have a like interest to yours, and work with them as a coalition to build your voice. also accept the fact that you were created by God and you are invincible. And as Rocky said earlier, we don't have to explain or be ashamed of who we are. But we have to acknowledge we live in a political environment and not everyone is ready to receive and listen and learn. So you have to accept that. And I always say that my role as a advocate in this world is I have to think like a military, like I'm a military sergeant. What is it that I'm trying to change? Who are my enemies, if you will? Who are my supporters? And how do I develop a strategy to be able to make a point? And that point may be incremental because change may not come over time. So it does require some patience. It does require some strategic thinking and also to understand, and I was saying yesterday on a phone call, despite the way I may look, I've been in the mental health field for over 40 some odd years. And what's frustrating to me is I'm having the same conversation today that I had 40 years ago. In some cases, the people I'm talking to are still the same people. So change is slow, but I think if you have a passion, if you have a heart, you have commitment, you can and do see change over time. And it's just a difficult road. But hopefully one of the things that we can do, and this takes me to my closing remarks, unless any of my panelists have any else to say, what we're committed to do is helping you find that home where you can feel validated, you can feel welcome, and you can hopefully gain some knowledge and skills and give us knowledge and skills and everyone else who attends by creating a series of discussions and action items that we want to see this webinar as the beginning, and over the next 2 years or beyond, invite you to join us. And we don't have a schedule right now, we're going to work on that, where we can have these open and frank discussions and where you can voice your concerns. It won't always be the same people on the panel because there are more people that have things to say. But if you have a specific question, a specific need that you would like for us to address, please, please, please let us know that. Our commitment is to respond to you either directly or through webinars, and hopefully collectively, in that sense of we are a community, let's build a change movement so that for our brothers and sisters and family that are in the mental health system, be it a public or private, we can help to improve their experiences. So some of the things that we know don't work and should not be, that we can have collective voice in making those changes. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone. I want to thank you to the National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health Technology Transfer Center for hosting this meeting and giving me the opportunity to moderate, to Deanna, Sean, Rocky, and to Cindy. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and to thank you for everyone. And please don't forget to fill out the evaluation, as well as to give us more information about what you'd like to see in future, and stay tuned. We hear you and we want to be there for you. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to add, there were a few questions specifically addressed to me. So I believe, Cindy or Angel can, I give you full permission to give participants my email. And if they have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I will reply. And
Okay.
thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Diana, and thank you, Oscar. I wanted to thank all the presenters for today's panel and conversation. And I also wanted to thank the audience. We had more questions and we really wanted to address everybody's questions, but we obviously have a time frame and we want to honor that for everybody, our presenters and also the audience. But we also wanted to remind you, like Oscar said, please make sure you answer the survey that will come up after we end the webinar. We really want to take into consideration your recommendations or your ideas to expand on this topic for our future events. And with that in mind, Diana, thank you for letting us know about the email. I know that some of the questions were specifically for some presenters, and we'll make sure that everybody gets those questions. Besides that, I think we had a great discussion, and I just really wanted to thank everybody, and I hope that everybody has a great rest of the day. And thank you for joining us.